So, the likelihood that these prophecies came true by some random chain of events is all but impossible. Compare Petra to Jerusalem, another city often torn by war that still thrives today. Also remember that this is a fraction of the Bible prophecies made about nations that have been fulfilled. We could continue with other examples, but the point has been made. The Bible contains many prophecies, all of which accurately predict future events, something that no other sacred writing can claim. Like the prophecies in the book of Obadiah written about 585 BC, which is very far from 125 BC and all the rest. These were unbelievable predictions. It could be like predicting that everyone in Los Angeles will be killed and that South California will become uninhabited except for wild animals, while the rest of the United States continues normally. Okay, so what does that leave us with? That leaves us with one last question that he had. He pulled out Isaiah 63, and I saw other people pull this out as well, other Israelites. Basically Isaiah 63 talks about, like, the chapter begins with a question. It's asking, who's a figure that is striding from Edom? He is wearing splendid or, beautiful robes, but there's stained red blood, as if it was blood. That's what it says. Basra was an important city in Edom, and it was known as a sheep herding center. You can read Isaiah 34, verse 6 through 7. In chapter 34, we see clearly that the Lord has been slaughtering sheep and cattle of Edom, or in the cattle of Edom. This picture in the chapter 63, we see the Lord leaving Edom as if the battle was already won. So that's when they also jump over to Revelation verse 19 and 13, and they say, he is dressed in a robe dipped in blood, and his name is the Word of God. That's what it says in Revelation. And they take those two things and they say, oh, see, there it is. He's talking about Edom, because, they're using the same figurative speech as they do how they killed the Edomites. So that must mean that I guess he still got some more Edomites to kill. That's not the case. That's not what they're talking about. Because just like the people who are around then know that Edom was gone, which I've proved, there's no such thing as Team Edom no more. They ain't a team, they ain't a nation, they ain't nowhere. And everyone in the ancient world knows it. That's why no one talks about them. If you're looking for them, you might as well start looking for some Jews. Anyway, so they, God or Jesus, whoever's writing down the prophecies, John the Revelator, he had to be talking about somebody. So if it wasn't Edom, then who was he talking about? Well, let's find out. So the only enemies that were really around in the book of Revelation, now that, we're asking what people were they talking about, if they weren't Edomites, who were they? The only thing that we can come up with is, I guess, fake Christians, fake Jews, fake whatever. They decided to call these people the synogogue of Satan. This is the only enemies that are around. People who say they're Jews and are not, or people who say they're Christians and are not. People who say that they're in, but they're really not. People who are just enemies in God in general. These are the only people that they're talking about. So the word synagogue comes from a Greek word meaning assembly of men or congregation, and it was used much like the English word church. The synagogue of Satan, then, is an assembly or congregation, a church made up of the individuals who say they are Jews and are not. The term Jew is used here in a spiritual sense. Notice the Apostle Paul's definition of a spiritual Jew in Romans chapter 2, verse 29. He is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart, in the spirit, and not in the letter. Whose praise is not from men, but from God. In this case, it's not one's physical race that counts, but his spiritual condition, as they are spiritual Jews. Those in the synagogue of Satan say that they are spiritual Jews. They pretend to be Christians, but are not. This false church was already developing in the days of the Apostle John, masquerading as God's true church. The only church I've known to really masquerade like that back then with a lot of power was the Catholic Church. But that's a whole nother video. So let me continue. It had congregations in the cities of Smyrna and Philadelphia, in Asia Minor, even at the early time. It and its daughter churches are further described in Revelation chapter 17, and you can read that for yourself with detailed files and information. One of the hallmarks of Satan's activities is deception, particularly counterfeiting the things of God. For such are the false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into apostles of Christ. And no wonder, for Satan himself transforms into an angel of light. Therefore, it is no great thing of his ministers or servants to transform themselves into ministers of righteousness, whose end will be according to their works. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 13 through 15. You can read that. Jesus says, we will know such false ministers by their fruits. Matthew chapter 7, verses 15 through 20. Thus, we should make sure that the church we attend and its ministers are following biblical doctrines and producing the fruit of righteousness. Otherwise, it may well be a synagogue of Satan. So, note that each of these congregations, when you read in Revelation about, Jesus actually talking to these certain churches, let's see what they're talking about. In terms of, because we're still trying to find some more about these enemies here. And we're also going to find out who were the allies. Now, the Hebrew Israelites say that, the only allies are Jews, because Jews are the only people that Jesus died for, and Jews are only going to heaven, or Israelites are only going to heaven. Let's find out what the ancient world was like. It says, note that each of these congregations, those in Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamos, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea were located in a Gentile city, and in all probability, each congregation's membership was primarily Gentile. It is quite likely that in each congregation the Jews were a minority. Recall that the Romans ravaged Jerusalem in 70 AD, and its Christians had had to flee to Pella to save their lives. It is highly probable that none of these congregations had any communication with any survivor of the first congregation in Jerusalem. All of the apostles, except John, were dead. I repeat, all of the apostles, except John, were dead. And he had been banished to Patmos. This circumstance was far different from the one in which the church was founded. Were the Gentile congregations still a part of the true church? Were they free from the laws and perfect in their character, attitudes, and doctrines? Would such a negative judgment eliminate them from being a true assembly? Consider the further factors. In Revelation chapter 2, verse 4, Jesus basically commends the congregation. You can read it. It's in red. This is what they say the words of Jesus is. If you don't believe me, it's like saying, I don't believe John the Revelator wrote down anything true. So let me continue. So again, consider the further factors, or the facts, or whatever. It says, Revelation chapter 2, verse 4, he basically commends, or Jesus commends the congregation in Ephesus for doctrinal vigilance, but castigates it for leaving its first love. And you can also look at Revelation chapter 2, verses 9 through 11. Interesting. Shows Christ condemning Smyrna for being spiritually rich, but he also admonishes them to overcome. Despite his commendation, they are not a finished product. Revelation chapter 2, verse 13 through 15 praises those in Pergamos for not denying their faith, but its members are doctrinally divided. and they commit heresy to continue. In Revelation chapter 2, verses 19 through 20, he presets Thyatira as growing in good works, but its members tolerate heresy and are guilty of sexual immorality. I mean, I could go on and on and on with this list, and basically it shows John the Revelator is writing about how Jesus is speaking to him to tell these Gentile churches that he loves him, he wants to work with them, he wants to have a relationship with them. He wants them to do right, but at the same time they still have heresies and old ways. Here it is, Jesus is interacting with Gentiles on a salvation level.